Hey everybody! Welcome to today's Geometry Nodes Deep Dive. Today we're going to look at both the set, position, and transform geometry nodes. We'll discuss the basic usage of each node and when to use which one. We'll also look at how they integrate with an instance on points node. Then we'll dive into creating this little island of sand, rocks, and sawgrass to tie it all together. If you find this video useful, please be sure to give me a like and subscribe for future Blender goodness. Let's go ahead and open a Geometry Nodes editor over here, or jump over to the Geometry Nodes workspace if you prefer. I'm going to close the side menu with N and turn on snapping in the upper right hand corner. Now we can create a new Geometry Nodes modifier. We can delete the default input, and next we're going to add a mesh grid. We'll bump the size up to 10 by 10 and change both vertices to 16. And we can go ahead and hook this up to our output. Let's resize this window a bit so we can see our mesh. Next, we're going to add a transform geometry node. We can see here that we have both components or matrix to choose from at the top. We'll look at components first, which just means that the values will come from the transform, rotate, and scale options below, or values that are directly plugged into them. We can see that we can directly move our mesh as a whole on the X, on the Y, and on the Z axis. Similarly, we can rotate on the X axis, on the Y axis, or on the Z axis. Naturally, we can also scale on the X axis or the Y axis, but since this is a plane and has no height, we cannot scale it on the Z axis. We can also use a combination of any of these axes when we're transforming our geometry. We'll reset these now, but as you can see, scaling anything to 0 makes it disappear. Let's fix this by making it 1 once more. Now we'll take a brief look at the matrix option. This allows you to bring in a matrix for your transformation. For now, we'll add a combined transform. Essentially, these are the same settings as we have in the transform geometry node. But using it this way would allow us to control several transforms together. We'll simply use this in this example the same way we would use the same fields on the transform geometry node. We won't go into depth here, but I found a good video that explains the matrix functionality and creates a cool little project with it. I'll put a link to that below and probably flash it here on the screen as well. Not sponsored or anything, just something I found helpful. Let's go back to our components setting, and we're going to add a set position node right after our transform geometry node. We'll take a look at each of these sockets: selection, position, and offset. This node will operate on the vertices of a mesh rather than on the mesh as a whole. Let's go ahead and add a noise texture. We're going to plug this directly into the offset socket. This will take the vertices position and offset it by the amount input. The noise texture gives us some randomish vectors, and so our vertices move in a somewhat random direction, as we can see in our grid. Let's pull up a random value and set it to Boolean. Then we can plug this into our selection. This will randomize which vertices are affected. You can see that some portions of our mesh are still flat. And as we change our probability, we can control how much of our mesh remains unaffected. Now let's remove our offset and selection and take a look at the position socket. We'll first bring in a position node, which represents the current position for each vertex. And so if we connect this to the position socket, our mesh will not move at all. The difference between the position and the offset is that when you set the position, you are substituting the position for the vertex rather than adjusting it based on the current position. Let's go ahead and add a vector math node so we can observe how position will affect our mesh. We're going to use a random value in our vector math node, and we'll change this to a vector value. We'll plug this into the second socket of our vector math, and since we are using an add and the current position, the random vertex is essentially acting as an offset. So what happens if we plug our random value directly into our position? All of our vertices are moved from their current position into the random position. Because these values are all between 0 and 1, we have kind of a square cube left between 0 and 1 values on each axis. And each vertex is at a random point within that cube. We can adjust the values in our random vector to adjust the space where our random values appear. And when we disconnect that, our vertices go back to their original position. If we adjust the values in the offset, it will offset all vertices by the same amount. This makes this behave exactly like the transform geometry on the translation settings. Let's move our set position node over so we can add an instance on points node. We'll add an icosphere for our instance. Let's set our radius to 0.2 and our subdivisions to 3. And then we'll plug this into our instance socket. Let's adjust our transform and note how all of our instances will move together. This is expected because we are transforming the grid, which holds the points for the instance on points, one point equating to one vertex. Let's plug back in our random selection and our noise texture offset. We can see that this will offset the selected instances, each as an entire instance. Let's add a math node and scale our offset. We'll change this so we are only moving our instances on the z-axis. We need to add both a combine XYZ node and a separate XYZ node. And we'll bring over only the z-axis values. We can adjust our multiplier up and down to change the effect. Let's change our noise texture to 4D and animate our affected instances. We'll keyframe the W at 0 on frame 0 using the I key. We'll then move to the end and keyframe the W at point 2. And now our instances have some movement. Let's move our set position over a bit so we can see what happens when we plug in a realize instance node. We can see that our set position now affects every vertex on each instance, rather than moving each instance as a whole. We'll bring our multiplier down a bit to better see this effect. Now we're going to take a brief look at rotation. Let's bring our grid up on the z-axis. And we'll now rotate it on the x-axis. You can see that the rotation occurs around the median point of the grid. Now let's add another transform geometry node. Now, when we rotate our grid on the x-axis on the second transform geometry, it rotates around the origin point instead. Let's go ahead and disable our cube from the viewer and from rendering so we can tackle our wrap-up project. Now we'll add a new mesh. I'll use a plane, which is kind of a standard I see a lot of people use, but really you can use any mesh. We'll add a new geometry nodes modifier, and let's remove the group input node. We're going to add an icosphere that will be the base shape for our little island. We'll set the radius to 5 meters and the subdivisions to 4. Let's go ahead and hook that up to our output. Now we're going to hook up a transform geometry node and set the shape for our island. We're going to adjust the scale. Let's set the x value to 0.9, the y value to 1.3, and the z value to 0.2. And now we have a little disc shape. Let's add a set position node so we can distort our geometry a bit. Similar to our previous example, let's add a noise texture to use in our offset. Let's also add a separate XYZ and plug our noise texture factor into the vector socket. We're going to scale each of our axes separately, so let's add some math nodes. Let's set our first math node to multiply and hook up our x-axis value. We'll then set the multiplier to 0.3. We can duplicate this math node with Shift D and set the same value for our y-axis. We'll duplicate this once more for our z-axis, but set that multiplier to 0.6. This way our vertices will be affected more vertically than they are horizontally. Next we'll add a combine XYZ node for our values. And then we can plug that into the offset. Now we can see some distortion in our island. Next, we're going to add a shade smooth node to our island base. we're going to head over to the shader editor to create a new material for our sand. Let's add a Voronoi texture, and we'll set the feature to F2. Then we'll set the distance metric to Chebyshev. Now let's bring in a color ramp. We'll set our white color to a sandy beige color, and then we'll copy the hex code for that color. Now let's select the black and paste in our copied hex code. Then we'll make this a darker tone of beige. We'll hook up the color ramp to the base color of our BSDF. And we'll bring the distance from the Voronoi texture into the factor of the color ramp. Now let's come back and adjust the scale of the Voronoi. I'll bring mine up to 20. We'll bring our detail up around 7. We'll name this color Sand. Now let's head back over to the Geometry Nodes editor. Right before the Output node, we'll add a Set Material node. And we can set our material to the sand material we just created. Now let's change to Rendered View so we can see our material. Our sand is lacking some texture, so let's go back to the shader editor and add a bump node. We'll bring in the distance from the Voronoi and plug that into height. Then we can plug the normal from the bump node into the normal of the BSDF. That's a little too much texture, so let's bring down the strength quite a bit. We'll also set the distance to 0.1. And then let's adjust our strength a little bit more and take our distance down to 0.05. Now let's head back over to Geometry Nodes and we'll gear up to add some objects to our island. First, let's put a Join Geometry node directly in front of our group output. Let's select all of the nodes up to and including our Set Position node. We're going to group these using Ctrl-J, and then we'll use F2 to label the frame. We'll call this Base, and we're going to use it to instantiate our scene objects so that we can map to the adjusted vertices. Then we'll group our Set Shade Smooth and Set Material nodes and label them Sand. Now we're going to create some rocks. Let's add a Distribute Points on Faces node. We'll put an Instance on Points node right after that. We'll add an icosphere for our rock instances. And now let's bring the geometry from our base group and plug that into the mesh socket here. And we'll plug the points from the distribute points on faces into the points socket of the instance on points node. We'll bring the icosphere into the instance socket, and we'll bring the instances into the join geometry node. Our instances are definitely too big, so let's bring our radius down to 0.1, and we'll bump the subdivisions up to 2. Now we want to move our icosphere over so we can bring in a set position. Since real rocks are not perfectly round, we're going to adjust the shape of our icospheres. Let's bring in a random value node, and we'll set the type to vector. Then we'll bring that into the offset. Now it looks like we need to adjust the amount of displacement. We're going to set the max values all to 0.03, and we'll then set the min values to -0.01. We can see that this makes our spheres more rock-like, but they are all obvious copies of each other. Let's duplicate the random value vector node. We want to set these values back to the defaults at 0 and 1. We're going to plug this into the rotation value of the instance on points to give our rocks some variation. We can notice that we have rocks appearing on the underside of the island as well as the edges. We'll address that now. Let's add a position node. We then want to add a separate XYZ node, and we can bring our position into the vector socket here. Now let's add a math compare node, which will default to greater than, which is what we want to use in our situation. We're going to bring over the z-axis value here. Let's adjust our comparison value up a little bit. What we're going to do is plug this into the distribute points on faces selection socket, and what that tells it is only distribute points on faces where the z-axis value is greater than our comparison number. That way we can eliminate all these unnaturally placed rocks. We need to adjust our comparison value up a bit more, and as we do that, we can see the edge rocks disappear. And we'll bring that up until we are happy with our rock placement. There are also a few too many rocks for my liking, so I'm going to adjust my density down a bit. We're going to select all of our rock nodes and join them into a frame using Ctrl-J. We'll label that group rocks. Our rocks need a material, so let's go back to the shader editor. We'll add another slot and a new material. Let's bring in our old friend, the Voronoi texture. We'll set the distance metric to Manhattan this time. We'll bring the scale up to 16 or so, and set the detail to 0.6. We also want to adjust the roughness up a bit to around 0.6 or 0.7. Now let's add a color ramp. Let's bring our white value over a bit, and then we're going to set it to a darker gray color. Then we'll plug distance into factor, and then color into the base color. We'll go over to Geometry Nodes and add a Set Material node. And we'll add this to our rocks frame. I realize I forgot to name our rock material, so let's head back to the shader editor to do that. We'll name this rock, and now we can return and assign it. For our grass, we are going to append a file where I have created some example sawgrass. We'll use File Append and then navigate to our sawgrass.blend file. It will then ask us what specifically we want to append, and we'll drill down into Collection and choose Sawgrass. Now we can see our sawgrass is in our outliner. We'll come right back to that. First, let's set up our Distribute Points on Faces node and bring our base geometry into it. Then we'll add our Instance on Points node. We'll hook these two together and then connect this to our Join Geometry node. Now we can drag our collection in from the outliner window. We'll plug this directly in for our instances. We won't need to set any material for our grass because that is already built in. We'll bring our density up a bit to around 25, and we'll also change the seed so that our grass instances aren't placed in the same spots as our rock instances. We have the same issue we had with our rocks because the grass is going all the way to the water's edge, and it wouldn't necessarily do that on a sandy beach. So let's set up a similar selection criteria we did with the rocks, but we'll pull the grass a little further back from the edge this time. We'll bring in Position, add a Separate XYZ node, hook up the Position node, and then add a Math Comparison node. Then we'll bring the Z value in and hook the compare up to our selection socket. Here I ended up bringing it into the Instance on Points node, and this is slightly less efficient than plugging it into the Distribute Points on Faces node, because it will still have to calculate all of the points before passing them along to be excluded in the Instance on Points node. Feel free to use the selection on the Distribute Points on Faces node instead. Now we can adjust our comparison value up until we have a nice little beach section. Now we can tidy our workspace and join our grass nodes together. Using F2, we can label these nodes grass. Let's rename this to Island. And what good is an island without water? So let's go ahead and add a plane. We'll scale this up by a good amount. And then let's bring it up on the Z-axis. Now let's go over and add a water material. The majority of this setup came from another YouTube video from Poly Playground, and I will link that below as well. Let's add a new material. And we're going to remove our principled BSDF. Let's add a mix shader and then hook that up. We'll add a glass BSDF and a refraction BSDF. We'll bring in a color ramp, and we're going to set the white color to a very light blue, and then we'll set the black color to more of a blue-green. Let's bring our blue over about halfway. And then we can hook our color ramp up to the glass BSDF. Let's set the IOR of our refraction shader to 1.3. Next, we're going to add a noise texture. We're going to set this to 4D so that we can animate our water if we want to. We'll bring the scale up around 30. And then we'll add a vector bump node, and we'll bring the factor into the height. Now we'll plug this into the normal of our glass BSDF. Let's also bring the strength of our bump node down around 0.25. Now let's add an area light. We'll bring this up on the Z-axis and then scale it up. Now let's adjust it to be a slightly warm color and bump the power up to around 1000. Now we're going to change our shader selection from object to world. We'll add a mix color node right before the background node. We'll bring in a sky texture and plug that into our first color socket. Now let's change our second color to a slight orangey red. We'll bring the strength down some. I've set mine around 0.6. We can also adjust the mix if we want. And actually, I'm going to bring my strength down again to 0.4. Let's remove our shader editor window now. And let's set up our camera to render this out. Let's go ahead and animate our water. I'm going to go back and forth to the shader workspace to capture the W values I want in the noise texture since I closed the window. At frame 0, I'm going to keyframe it to 0. Now we'll go to the end frame and key it at about 0.2. Now we can play the animation and watch the water move. I'm going to adjust my camera a bit to get a better angle. I'm going to just render out a still, but feel free to render the entire animation if you like. That's going to conclude today's discussion of the set position and transform geometry nodes. I hope you found this helpful and useful. Feel free to comment below if you have any questions or feedback. Let me know what Blender projects you are working on or what nodes you'd like more information on. Please like and subscribe for more Blender content, and I hope to see you in the next video. Have a great day, and I wish you a very happy Blendering.